Information-fueled.
Opinion-driven.
This is Nashville's Morning News with Dan Mandis.
And so, my fellow Americans,
we talk news.
7:06, Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Good morning to your friends. Hope you're doing well on a wet and rainy Monday. I want to welcome on into the program Hans von Spakovsky with the Heritage Foundation. Hans, always great to have you on. You are such an incredible legal mind. And so let's get right to it. You have the Democrats that are saying that Donald Trump is ignoring the Supreme Court. He is wanting to continue to deport folks under the 1798 Alien Enemies Act. Now, people on the left, of course, and some conservatives say that these folks are not getting their due process. The president says using the Alien Enemies Act means that he can deport these people, I'm going to air quote this, without due process. Where do you stand on all this?
Well, what I say to those who are claiming that the Trump administration is violating the law, point out to me a single instance where they've done it. So far, they've actually obeyed every court order issued, even when some of those court orders, frankly, have been beyond the authority of the judge. And look, the latest instance of this and the latest developments of the case, if I were to write an op-ed about it, which I might, I would title it, How the ACLU Conned the Supreme Court.
Talking about Saturday, right?
Yeah, because look, here's what happened. These Venezuelan gang members had a lawsuit filed on their behalf by the ACLU where in Washington, D.C. And yeah, Judge Boasberg said, oh, I'm issuing an order. You can't remove these guys. Well, by the time he issued his order, these Venezuelans were already in El Salvador. Okay.
Yep.
But here's the key thing. All of this was appealed, but what Boasberg was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court said, Boasberg, you don't have jurisdiction over this. The only way an alien can challenge his removal under the Alien Enemies Act is to file what's called a habeas corpus petition. That's a petition where you come in and say, hey, I'm being wrongfully imprisoned. And under federal law, the only place you can file a habeas petition is where you are detained. So not only did Boasberg not have jurisdiction over the case because there weren't any habeas petitions in front of him, but it had to be filed down in Texas where there were still Venezuelan gang members being held. So the ACLU goes down to Texas. They file their habeas petitions on several of the Venezuelan gang members. And when the judge down there refuses to issue an order saying that the U.S. has to keep these guys in the U.S. because the judge said, well, you haven't presented me with any evidence, ACLU, that they're going to be removed. In fact, the government has done what the Supreme Court has said, given them notice that they're going to hold a hearing on whether they can be removed. The ACLU files an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court Friday night claiming, the government is about to remove hundreds of Venezuelans without giving them any notice of a right to a hearing. There was no such evidence. In fact, the lower court said there's no evidence the government's about to remove them. And what does the Supreme Court do? They basically, in the middle of the night, without even hearing from the government, without actually any evidence to support what the ACLU says, all right, while this case is pending in the lower courts, none of these guys will be removed. So the status quo is still the same. Basically, these guys have to file a habeas petition wherever they're detained, like down in Texas. But the Supreme Court should never have issued that order in the first place because they got conned by the ACLU.
Well, and the other thing, for those people, Hans von Spakovsky joining us, for those people that say that Trump is defying and not listening to the Supreme Court, they had these guys in buses on their way to the airport, and those buses turned around.
Yeah.
So obviously he is listening to the Supreme Court. But, Hans, when there seems to be this battle over whether or not Trump is justified in deporting using the 1798 Alien Enemies Act because, and I would, if you can walk me through this and walk folks through this. So we're always, in my opinion, and in the opinion of Donald Trump, always engaged in a war on terror. So when he ended up using the 1798 Alien Enemies Act to deport these gang members, justifying by saying that MS-13 and designating MS-13 and Tren de Aragua as terrorist organizations, well then, according to what I read about this law, he is allowed to deport these folks without due process because he has designated them as alien enemies.
Yeah, they have extremely limited means of defying it. And look, the key case on this, you know how some people have said, oh, well, you can't use that law unless you're at war, right, with the other side. Wrong. The key case on this is a 1948 U.S. Supreme Court case in which, under the Alien Enemies Act, guess what we did? We deported German nationals years after World War II had ended, and the court said, yeah, you can do that.
Okay, so it seems clear, at least clear to me as I listen to you, he is justified in using that. Then I guess the question is, okay, well then what's next in this? I mean, we've got hundreds, thousands of these illegal alien gang members in this country, spread all across the country. So what does the president do now? Does he continue to use the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, or does he try some other means to get these folks out? Because, you do have all these people screaming that these, angels of society have not had their due process. And it does seem to be a legal fight that is going to continue.
Well, you got to divide up these aliens into different classes. For those who are members of these gangs that have been designated as terrorist groups, there's no doubt he's going to continue to use the Alien Enemies Act, and eventually it's going to get back to the Supreme Court. And remember, up until now, the Supreme Court has just issued procedural decisions.
Yes.
They haven't actually ruled on the substantive merits of that. So it's going to get back to the court. But for many of these illegal aliens, there are standing deportation orders on them. They've already had their due process. And immigration judges have ordered that they be removed from the United States. And those individuals, once that deportation order has been issued, DHS can pick them up, and all they're doing is enforcing the immigration judge's order. So they're actually complying with the law, not violating the law. And these guys have had their due process rights.
Yep.
They had a chance to appear before an immigration judge and say, oh, no, I'm entitled to be U.S. And the judges said no. And so those folks have a very limited ability. And remember, there's another third class. There's an immigration statute that gives the Attorney General the ability to remove from the U.S. a whole series of aliens who fit within certain categories, criminals, and this is applicable to all these foreign students who are out supporting Hamas.
Yep.
If you don't have to be a member of a terrorist organization. If you simply espouse support for a terrorist organization, the Attorney General can have you removed from the United States. And that's the situation with that guy at Columbia University.
Mahmoud Khalil.
Yeah.
So, all right, very good. Hans, it's raining here. Traffic is a mess. So I'm gonna get back to you, and I want to get into some specifics regarding Kilmar Abrego Garcia. That is coming up next. Hans von Spakovsky is joining us. Time to check the roads on WTN. Weather today, obviously raining. It's going to continue to rain off and on. A high of 75. Thunderstorms continue. Appreciate you listening to Nashville's Morning News. Hans von Spakovsky is joining us on the Newsmaker Hotline. All right, Hans, so Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Now, you have the folks on the left and some in the courts, Boasberg and others, I guess, are saying that the Trump administration has to, and this term is important, as you know, facilitate his return to America. Now, there is a big debate going on because the Supreme Court said facilitate They did not utilize the term effectuate. Talk about the importance between those two terms.
But there's also another line that was very important that the folks are leaving out. The Supreme Court said facilitate, but the district court needs to give due deference to the president's authority to handle foreign policy.
Oh,
so what?
Okay.
That was in the order. So what that means is they were telling the lower court, the district court, you cannot order the president to bring this guy back. You cannot say to him, I'm giving you a deadline, which remember the judge had originally done. I'm giving you a deadline. He has to be back. What effectuate means, well, the executive branch should take, the steps that it can take to try to convince the El Salvadoran government to send this guy back.
Yeah, to be more proactive.
Right. Well, the El Salvadoran president already said publicly at his meeting in the White House, I ain't sending this guy back.
Yep.
That ought to end the matter right there, because the president of the United States cannot force the president of El Salvador to send an El Salvadoran citizen to the United States.
Now, people on the left, and again, this goes back to the process, the discussion we were talking about before, which is due process. They're saying that Kilmar Abrego Garcia did not have due process, but, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you had two courts that actually deemed him an MS-13 gang member. And then it turns out he was stopped here in Tennessee, suspected of human trafficking. He had, 8 guys in there in his car. He's driving erratically. He had an expired driver's license. He pretended not to speak English, and yet they allowed him to drive away, which is a whole nother conversation, but infuriating nonetheless. But it does seem to me like Kilmar Abrego Garcia did get his due process.
Of course he did. He got 2 hearings before federal immigration judges. Now, folks are pointing, listen, both of those judges said, you're in the country illegally, you have no right to be here. Now, one of the judges gave him a temporary waiver because he was supposedly afraid he would be injured by this rival gang, a rival gang of MS-13 if he went back to the country. That rival gang is no longer in existence. The news, which people can easily Google, they'll find out that the president of El Salvador, one of the reasons he came in was because he said, I'm going to break up these gangs. And that particular gang he broke up. Not only that, but the Attorney General of the United States can overrule the findings of any immigration judge. That is a matter of federal law and Justice Department regulations. And clearly the Attorney General here has said that waiver is no longer in effect. Therefore, we are enforcing the orders of these deportation judges who said you're illegal in the U.S. So anybody claims he hadn't gotten his due process, they're just lying. The record of his immigration case shows he got plenty of due process rights, and judges said, you're here illegally, not entitled to be in the U.S.
So I know it is impossible, Hans, to predict the future, but how long before all of this do you believe will be settled ultimately by the Supreme Court, and do you have a prediction as to what will happen? Will the president be allowed to continue to use the 1798 Alien Enemies Act to deport these folks, and what does that timeline look like?
It's already mid-April. The Supreme Court ends its session in June. I don't think this will get to back to the U.S. Supreme Court until the fall of this year, and I think the president will be ultimately successful the very same way he was successful during his first administration when, if you'll recall, he closed the border and said there will be no entry allowed of aliens from certain countries around the world, places like Iran and North Korea. Remember, He got sued all over the country. All these liberal federal district court judges said you can't do that. Remember, was the travel order.
Well, they called it the Muslim ban.
Yeah, that got to the U.S. Supreme Court, and what did the U.S. Supreme Court say? The president has complete and full both constitutional and statutory authority under immigration law to do this. He was ultimately successful, and I think the same thing will happen here.
All right. Hans, always great to have your perspective on this. Again, one of the great legal minds of our time, Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation. Hans, have a great rest of week. It is 7:22 on Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7. Joan Jones is in the WTN newsroom. Joan, what's coming up?
Well, Dan, we've got a couple of things coming up here at 7:30. The Trump administration calling on the Supreme Court to reverse itself. Also, a shooting at a downtown spot in Nashville overnight. Details on what happened there. That's coming up at 7:30 on Super Talk 99.7 WTN.